The fact that Billy even took a knife to the burglary indicates that he may have had the intention of using it. On the other hand, the knife possibly helped Billy to feel tough, so he could build up the nerve to enter the home and commit the robbery. It seems, however, that the violence, blood, and death was too much for him to handle. Manipulative killers will often seek their partners using a certain pattern. As we see here, they'll joke about things like crime and murder to see who's completely repulsed and not a potential accomplice and who will let it slide. Eventually, they'll take it further down the path of dark crime jokes or actions until the other person is complicit in something serious with no way to escape. This may have been the case with Stephen, although Billy asserts that there was never an orchestrated plan, and he thought the mutual understanding between the group was that it would be a robbery and nothing more. But later it was revealed that he and Stephen had previously scouted Trow Road for a house to burglarize, even telling a friend on Saturday, October 3rd, that Stevie was planning a breaking and entering. Not only this, but Billy had been flaunting his assisted opening knife, allegedly stating that he was planning on using it on a police officer or someone else. Supposedly, Stephen had even requested that a friend research how to make the dangerous concoction. Apparently, the Friday before the attack, Stephen had told Autumn that he had a plan in mind for that weekend, but didn't want to divulge any details to his friend. His reason being that he wanted Autumn to stay out of trouble. However, Stephen will involve him soon enough. Despite Stephen and Christopher's alleged plan, Billy asserts that they did not bring the chloroform after all. While the little girl struggled to call the police, the assailants quickly fled on foot back to Christopher's car, where they each had a new pair of clothes to change into. They drove Billy back to his vehicle at Walmart and later dropped Quinn off at his house before Stephen and Christopher made their way to Autumn's place around 5:30 in the morning. Before leaving the Cates' house, Stephen had allegedly wished to carve the words "You're lucky" into the neighbor's outside wall, seeing as they were almost chosen as the innocent victims. This likely indicates that Stephen may have been on a sort of high after murdering Kimberly, feeling like a villain and that he had the power to spare the people next door. It's very rare for a murderer to make this sort of admission, although it's horrific to hear and very confusing for the average person to understand such a desire. It's this type of information that helps us to understand the mind of someone with severe antisocial personality disorder. They don't value human life the way a typical person does, and only think of their own needs and desires, their own urges, as Christopher insightfully described. They often know right from wrong, as Christopher verbalized earlier of how horrific it would be for someone to harm a woman, let alone a little girl, but they don't guide themselves by moral principles. People with antisocial personality can often learn to mimic normal human emotion, but they don't actually feel that emotion. Christopher may very well be enjoying the process of telling the story because he gets to relive the incident. This may be why he's being so forthcoming, providing so much detail, even laying out his feelings and thought process. He's giving the detectives much more than what they're asking for, but it's unlikely that he's doing it to help the detectives because, like he said, he doesn't care or feel bad, and he isn't sure if he has a conscience. Even with the possibility of being locked in prison for the rest of his life, he may be able to feel some satisfaction thinking back to the memory of the crime. It's likely that Stephen was the more sadistic of the two, although Christopher seems to definitely have sadistic tendencies. It seems that Stephen was more of the savage, violent criminal who plotted the crimes, while Christopher was more of the brains of the operation. Even Autumn can recall Stephen's volatile nature. According to Autumn, Stephen had apparently proclaimed at one point, "You have no idea what I'm capable of." This sort of obsession with murder and enjoyment of the act itself is common among people with severe antisocial personality disorder. Oftentimes, they'll commit murder as a means to an end, such as to obtain money or to avoid being caught if a victim lives and is able to identify them. It's less common when the person actually takes pleasure in the act of murder. This is often evidenced by the weapon that is chosen and the manner that the murder was executed. For instance, using a machete may indicate enjoyment of the process, since it involves closer contact with the victim and their death is prolonged. Using a firearm could indicate that the person simply wanted to kill the victim as quickly as possible, as it provides physical distance and often kills quickly.
And Steve had mentioned before that he's killed multiple people. He said this one wasn't his first mom and daughter job either, or in the driveway.
It's possible that Stephen was lying about his alleged previous murders to impress the group. However, it may have also been a form of manipulation. He wanted them to feel confident that he'd already gotten away with murder before, so they could trust that he would make sure they got away with it this time too. Although Stephen's claims have never been confirmed, the fact that he would make such alarming claims is enough to shock you to your core. After the horrific ordeal, Christopher and Stephen made their way to Autumn's house around 5 in the morning, where the young man seemed to be unaware of what had just occurred. Autumn was of the impression that they had committed a robbery and not a murder. However, as the attackers showcased their newfound possessions, he was more than willing to help dispose of the evidence. Hoping to put some distance between them and the murder, they planned to burn the remaining evidence. But Autumn supposedly had the idea of throwing it into the Nashua River instead. Although, ironically enough, he would ultimately be the one to lead police directly to it. Although Autumn asserts that he had no previous knowledge of the intended crime, his story seems to contain a few holes. During his interrogation, Autumn jumped at the first opportunity to confess, showing where he, Stephen, and Christopher had thrown a black trash bag with a small jewelry box, an air conditioner screen, rubber gloves, a plastic bag with an insurance card belonging to David Cates, a red sweatshirt with Stephen's name, socks with Christopher's name, and several other items placed inside. Christopher and Stephen had also buried some of the remaining jewelry, the machete, a knife, and 2 iPods, one from the Cates' home and one from their previous robbery in a wooded area near Christopher's house. But not before they had a chance to show off the terrifying weapons to their friends. Hours after the murder had taken place, Christopher, Stephen, Billy, and another friend, Eldon Spikes, had all been hanging out at their regular spot, Walmart, where Stephen had supposedly revealed the tale of horror. He was excited to tell the story, supposedly stating that he wished he could do it again, although the friends were unsure if Eldon had taken the words into account, considering that he had allegedly been high on numerous drugs. Christopher and Stephen then traveled to the Pheasant Lane Mall in Nashua, selling the jewelry for $130 at a cash for gold store, where they were actually stopped by police for appearing suspicious. They were informed that multiple robberies had recently taken place in Brookline and Mount Vernon, but of course, the two didn't confess their guilt. As a result, the officer didn't question them any further, but little did he know, he was staring into the faces of stone-cold killers. Later that day, Christopher and Stephen traveled to their friend Kyle Fenton's home, located in Brookline, and brought the machete and knife along with them. There, they proudly revealed their haunting secret, spilling every shocking detail about the murder, and parading the weapons as if it were show and tell. But what the teenagers managed to forget was that not everyone would share in their excitement at the gruesome crime, and some might even report it to the police. Fortunately, when Kyle informed his mother of the situation, she did exactly that. Christopher and Stephen's grandiosity had unsurprisingly backfired. In their excitement, they got too boastful and essentially participated in turning themselves in. However, the disturbing jokes were not shared by everyone, as Quinn was in disbelief at the gruesome attack. Quinn goes on to chillingly state that Stephen wanted to get Chris into killing by committing such an act. Unfortunately, the disturbing plan seemed to have worked. According to Quinn, Billy had wanted to be in the newspaper ever since he was a child, and given his crime, it seemed that it didn't matter how. Sunday night, the 4 criminals, along with Eldon, had been visiting at Quinn's house when the hangout suddenly turned volatile. Stephen, worried about Eldon's knowledge of the homicide, wished to dispose of the loose end. Unsurprisingly, Christopher was on board to commit yet another murder. But thankfully, Quinn stepped between the three and pleaded for Eldon's life. He assured his accomplices that not a word would be spoken of the incident, ultimately ending the confrontation. Christopher says this almost as if he wants the investigators to feel bad for him, rather than focusing on the fact that they just murdered a mother and brutally assaulted her child. Presenting Stephen in this way may be helpful to Christopher's case, although Stephen may or may not have said this. It's in Christopher's best interest to display Stephen as the more unempathetic and violent criminal. That way, Christopher believes he looks like a bit of a victim compared to his monster of a friend. On top of this, the other three apparently referred to Christopher as a murder virgin, as he was unable to complete the thrill kill. This bizarre claim may all be a front. Christopher may feel a sense of failure because Jamie lived. He doesn't want to be viewed as weak, so he suggests that he's only disappointed for her sake when in actuality, it likely has everything to do with him and nothing to do with her. At the same time, Christopher is once again presenting himself as a victim. However, this couldn't be further from the truth. Following the chilling confessions, Billy had supposedly discussed with his dad the idea of selling his story to various media outlets. Another indication of how heartless he was. In the end, Billy and Quinn were given plea deals for testifying against Christopher and Stephen. Billy pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, burglary, and first-degree assault, and sentenced to 30 to 60 years behind bars. In comparison, Quinn pleaded guilty to burglary, robbery, and conspiracy to commit burglary, receiving a sentence of 20 to 40 years. Autumn was eventually sentenced to a minimum of 5 years for hindering apprehension and conspiracy to hinder apprehension. In an unsuccessful attempt to avoid a first-degree murder charge, Christopher pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. The idea he'd been insane was quickly denied by the court psychiatrist, stating that he was well aware of his behavior and actively chose to commit such a horrendous crime. During his trial, Stephen appeared to not take the proceedings seriously when he made a shocking and unusual request to his attorney. There are a few different reasons behind this kind of behavior. One possibility is that Stephen could be trying to manipulate the situation and gain sympathy from the jury. By reminding them that it's his birthday, he might hope that the jury will feel more inclined to be lenient in their sentencing, or view him as more human and relatable. Another possibility is that he is simply trying to exert control over the situation. By asking about his birthday and the possibility of the jury singing, he's taking an active role in the proceedings, and potentially even trying to dictate the mood or tone of the courtroom. It's also possible that he's simply trying to assert some kind of dominance and show that he is unfazed by the gravity of the situation. Regardless of the specific motivation, it's clear that this kind of behavior is concerning and indicative of a serious lack of empathy or remorse, and shows that he's completely out of touch with the situation and why he's sitting there in the first place. In contrast, Christopher allegedly stated that if given the chance, nothing could prevent him from killing again. Both Stephen and Christopher were eventually convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Although in 2012, the United States Supreme Court ruled against sentencing minors to life without receiving any chance of parole. But shockingly, Stephen filed a motion not to appeal his conviction, and the New Hampshire Supreme Court granted it. Stephen's rationale behind the decision being that he is the most sick and twisted person you'll ever meet and should never be given a second chance. We reached out to speak with Stephen, but he declined to comment on the case. William Marks and Quinn Glover, who stood by and did absolutely nothing while Kimberly and Jamie were attacked, are likely to be paroled in the coming years. Quinn was granted parole on his robbery charge and will likely be released in 2029. William will be eligible for parole in 2024. Autumn Savoy was already released on parole in 2015.
This is Jeremy Christian, who was arrested for the murder of 2 men on a Max light rail train in Portland, Oregon. In May 2017, Christian stabbed and killed 53-year-old retired Army officer Ricky John Best and 23-year-old Talisin Mirdan Namkai Mecha. He also stabbed 21-year-old Micah Fletcher, but he survived. What happens next is the moment where it all began. Christian was captured on tape screaming anti-Muslim and racist slurs at 2 black teenagers. His behavior didn't sit well with several passengers. They confronted him and barred him from the frightened teenagers who had moved to the back of the train. Further attempts to de-escalate the situation resulted in Christian brandishing a knife, threatening to stab, and eventually stabbing the victims. But it doesn't end there. Here is Christian leaving the scene. After his 12 seconds of madness, Christian fled the train at the next transit center. Several passengers followed him as they called 911. Eventually, the police arrived and he was arrested, boasting about how he killed 2 people. But killing 2 people in broad daylight isn't enough. He was charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Not only did he show no remorse for his actions, he threatened to kill one of the relatives of a victim in court. During the trial, one of the victim's relatives read a victim's impact statement. Christian was eventually sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. During the trial, evidence of his criminal past came to light. It appeared that Christian had assaulted a woman and shouted racial slurs on another train the day before the murders. He was a self-described white nationalist and a far-right extremist. The judge added 25 years to his 2 life sentences for these other charges. However disrespectful Christian was, it was not as disrespectful as Randall Moore. In November 2011, Moore kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and killed Lynch. It all began when Lynch left Moore and filed a protective order against him, but Moore wasn't a man that let go easily. He kidnapped Lynch and set up a hostage situation. This was moments after Moore shot Officer Rowland. Fortunately, he survived the shooting. In a phone call with 911, Moore explains why he murdered his wife. Eventually, the police were able to breach the house and arrest him. Moore nodded when Judge Joel Novak confirmed that he had been found guilty on all charges.
The court doesn't allow me to punish you any more than I'm doing now. If I could, I would.
The judge allowed the victim's family to read their victim impact statement. What happens next is one of the most disrespectful moments that have ever happened in a court of law, as Lynch's mother took to the stand and read a sorrowful statement. But Moore got in a few words. Listen as Moore interrupts Lynch's mother's victim impact statement. But Moore wasn't done. When he was allowed to address the court, he showed no remorse for his crimes. Moore also tried to justify his crimes. However, Judge Novak had the last word. He berated Moore for his evil behavior and expressed shock at such a level of heartlessness. In the end, Moore was sentenced to 3 life sentences for the murder of Lynch and 25 years for shooting police officer Rowland. That is so many years to spend behind bars. But is it as bad as life sentences without the possibility of a parole?